Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, my fine friends. Welcome to Song 12 in Season 10 of the Tom Petty Project podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Brown. This is a weekly podcast that digs into the entire Tom Petty catalogue, song by song, album by album, and includes conversations with musicians, fans, and people connected with Tom along the way. Before we dig into social media, I just wanted to comment on some recent news from the Pettyverse. And before I do, I did want to sort of preface this by saying that I'm very, very rarely negative on this podcast because I feel that concentrating on positives is a much better use of energy and time. So I don't tend to dig into things like, politics or economics or religion or things like that, as they tend to be divisive rather than inclusive. And I believe that Tom and Tom's music was a unifier, not a divider. However, with all that said, there was some discussion on the Tom Petty Nation Facebook group this past week that I found really disappointing and in some cases unnecessarily cruel. Thankfully, the brilliant admins took care of the majority of it really quickly and removed the worst of the criticism, as they always do, keeping the space very positive. So, as many of you will know, Tom's wife Dana has put up for sale the classic 1965 Ford Mustang convertible that Tom bought for her as a Christmas gift in, I think, 2002. I will draw your attention, though, to the words bought for her, not lent to her or put in trust for her, but bought for her. Dana's clarified that she's parting with the vehicle because she's no longer able to safely drive it due to an ongoing eye condition and would rather see it being used by someone who will appreciate it rather than just having it collecting dust in her garage. She was also upfront about the fact that she didn't put a reserve on the vehicle in the auction and that all the proceeds from the sale will be donated to some of Tom's favourite charities. Nonetheless, some people decided that she's doing this for financial reasons or that to part with this car is somehow a betrayal of Tom's memory in some way, and I find this utterly incredible and completely ridiculous. As some of you know, I'm also a huge Queen fan. In fact, they were my first musical love, along with the Beatles, and I host a podcast diving into Queen's music and came up against a similar issue when Mary Austin, Freddie Mercury's best friend and the beneficiary of his estate upon his death, decided to sell his home and possessions at auction last year. As well as plenty of love and support, there was unfortunately also a cohort of very negative people accusing her of cashing in on Freddie's possessions. The only thing they seem to miss here is that Freddie died and left those possessions to Mary. At that point, they're not Freddie's possessions anymore. In a similar way, anything that Tom left to Dana is no longer Tom's. To suggest otherwise would be to ignore the wishes of the man himself. However, the case of that beautiful red Mustang is even more cut and dried. Tom bought that car for Dana. It is Dana and Dana alone who has the right to decide what happens to it. At the end of the day, I know it's the passion of fans for legacy to be preserved that drives a lot of this, but I think it's worth remembering that, at least in my opinion, musicians and artists always fans one thing and one thing only: their best effort when it comes to their art and performance. Nothing more. The partners of musicians and artists owes nothing at all. Yet Dana has always been incredibly generous in the memories and stories and private photos that she's shared with us fans over the years, especially since Tom's passing. And she's been one of the most ardent torchbearers for his legacy that you can imagine. So, to those who would suggest that she should not be selling one of her own possessions, or that her reasons for doing so are open for question by anyone, I'll paraphrase Tom and say, leave Dana alone. She's a class act, and she filled Tom's life with love and happiness for the better part of 2 decades. Anyway, in more positive news, it was fantastic to hear that Stan Lynch will be in Gainesville for the Tom Petty weekend this year with his excellent new band, The Speaker Wars. Hopefully I'll have a chance to chat to him at some point and pick his brains about some of the great work he did on those first 8 Heartbreakers albums, and you know what, all the stuff he's been doing since. So as well as being able to check off my bucket list seeing Jake Thistle and Jeff Slate perform live, I'm also going to see an OG Heartbreaker playing, which I'm just absolutely thrilled about. Right, now that's taken care of, let's jump over to social media and see what you were all saying about the song from a couple of weeks ago, To Find a Friend. Over on Facebook, Jack McNay comments, I always envision Tom Petty laconically and detachedly chronicling his surroundings while being fully immersed in the process of making music with friends. The last part adds a happy aura to otherwise somber lyrics, just friends getting away from all the muck and mire. And we've definitely talked about the escapism element of the lengthy recording process of this album. Every interview we see with people involved in the recording of Wildflowers comments on what a positive experience it was. So, Jack, I think you're probably right. Jill Lucas writes, another excellent episode, Kevin. Thank you so much. Lots of interesting twists and turns in the conversation with Will Porteous. And then you said you were from Wigan. Wow. I'm a huge Northern Soul fan and have a few friends who were in the 2014 film Northern Soul. Never made it to the casino, but I did go to Twisted Wheel in Manchester about 8 years ago. Never heard you mention Northern. Do you like? Now, as I mentioned to Jill, I think I was just a few years removed from the height of the Wigan Casino days, that era, but it was a legendary venue in the Northern music scene. And anyone I know who did attend any of those gigs at that venue said that it was an absolutely fantastic place to go see music. My pal Pete Nestor from the Honest and Unmerciful Record Review podcast left this lovely note for me. He says, "Forgive me, but I mean this sincerely when I say that, as always, the joy you bring to your discussion of the music makes me love the music even more. That's the gift you give us every week. Long live the Tom Petty Project and the years we have to look forward to for more great content." And I couldn't be happier than hearing Pete say that, because it means that my love of Tom's music is coming across. If you didn't check out my conversation with Pete from February of this year, go back and give that a listen. It really was a fantastic chat and very, very easy. It was like two old pals, and we've never actually met in person. It was like two old pals just having a chin wag over a pint. It was fantastic. So thanks again, Pete. JP Kaufman shared these personal insights. When all the dust settles after listening to this record probably hundreds of times over the years, I can't rock it till you wreck me no more. And I can't sail away with Wildflowers and Good to Be King. And it's been 25 years since I've rolled a joint, making You Don't Know How It Feels lose much of its point. And the brilliance in Time to Move On's poetry has faded on me. It is To Find a Friend and Wake Up Time that still cut me deep. For me, To Find a Friend has the lasting power few songs do. It hits a chord in me. Something about bravely taking my own journey in life. Something about struggling to make our own way. Maybe it is appreciating good times and very few good close friends when they come. It also makes me feel remorse for the mistakes, but also feel I'm wiser now. It makes me saddened watching others I care about making mistakes too. Not sure exactly which or what it is specifically, but in this song and Wake Up Time, I feel like Tom knows how it feels to be me and how it feels to be human, longing for purpose and deeper connection. Well, great art should move people, and clearly, even after 30 years, this song still connects with JP on a very personal level. Thanks so much for that one, JP. Very heartfelt and very, very cool. Executive producer Paul Roberts simply said, "Great pod, Kev." Thanks, as always, Paul. Nice little song. Always thought of it musically as Wildflowers Part 2, complete with midlife crisis lyrics. Obviously, it is much more. Nice interview, too. Well, I'm glad you enjoyed my chat with Will Porteous. I'm getting some good feedback on that one. And yeah, there's definitely a sonic connection between To Find a Friend and Wildflowers, and I think I even commented on that it's accentuated by that strumming pattern on the acoustic guitars that makes them, very comfortable bedfellows. We wrap up Facebook with future guest, Nora Hayward Olson, who says, "In another moment of reflecting on this song from my vantage point of 52 years of living, I hear people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s talk about how hard it is to find a friend, that they are lonely. The older and more isolated we get due to family and work obligations, the harder it is to make deep connections. I would imagine that adding the layer of being a celebrity and not knowing who to trust, who is genuinely your friend and who's a user, magnifies this 100-fold. And isn't that true? Fame would make trust a lot harder to come by and could easily turn you into a cynic. I like to think, though, that the type of fan base that Tom fostered is almost always positive and supportive, and I've sure as heck found a lot of friends during this journey through his career. Okay, well, we'll finish up social media over on Twitter. The ever-reliable Steve Ursel left this comment for me. "Another one of the songs that grabbed me instantly and pulled me into the album on first listen. Slightly funny, but mainly lovely, wistful lyrics. And you're so right about Benmont's outstanding tack piano solo. Short, but sublime." And I've talked plenty about the songs that really grabbed me when I first started listening to Wildflowers. And I will admit that this one, To Find a Friend, was more of a grower on me. And I think it's now among my favorites from the album, but of course, that's like choosing your favorite kids. Thanks as always to all of you who left your thoughts for me. It's always nice to hear what other people think, and I usually get a new perspective or something different to think about regarding the song after reading your comments. But without further ado, let's dig into this week's song, which is track 12 from this fantastic album, A Higher Place. In the liner notes for Wildflowers and all the rest, journalist Jaan Uhelzski writes the following about A Higher Place. "It is Campbell's soaring 12-string Rickenbacker and Tench's swirl of eccentric synthesizers that impels this song forward. So let's start with the swirl of eccentric synthesizers, because I'm a synth playing kind of guy. The song features the use of a keyboard instrument called an orchestron. Never heard of it? Well, yeah, neither had I. And with fairly good cause, because you don't really see them around all that much, and they weren't made for all that long. They weren't manufactured for an extended period of time. Rick Rubin reminisces of the days before Craigslist and eBay, when you'd look through actual magazines to find used instruments. And he says, when we were making this album, there was a little printed items for sale magazine. There was a section of used and vintage musical instruments for sale, and we'd look at that list every day to see if there was anything interesting, an odd instrument that we could end up finding a place for, creating a special sound for a special moment. There was an instrument called an orchestron that I had never heard of before. Tom and Ben said, "Oh, this thing is pretty cool. Not really something to use on a record, but it's cool." So I ended up buying it, and the orchestron makes an appearance on this particular song. It's the only time I've ever used it on a record. We might still have it around, though I haven't seen it for a while. And for his part, Tom tells author Paul Zolo in Conversations with Tom Petty that the orchestron is an old keyboard where you actually put in a plastic disc, which is the string sounds. And when you hit the keyboard, it activates this plastic disc, this record, and the record plays the note that you're playing. My own research turned up that the orchestron originally shipped with 8 different sound discs: violin, Hammond B3 organ, flute, cello, vocal choir, saxophone, pipe organ, and French horn. So it was almost like an early example of a sampler, which is really, really cool. And Tom goes on to explain the difficulties in using it, saying, very shaky, extremely shaky. I think one take on the record was all we could get out of the orchestron. But for one moment there, it all synced up and it worked. I'd never seen one before or since. I remember us just going, wow. Almost the first time he played it, he got that great thing. But then we couldn't get it to work anymore. We couldn't get it to do what we wanted it to do. I love that that's what sticks in everyone's mind, is the use of this mad little instrument that they only got like basically one take, it sounds like, out of. Before we get in, I'll talk a little bit more about the alternate version of this song at the end of the episode, but let's get into the song itself. A Higher Place starts with a smart snare fill leading into the bright, airy acoustic guitars. Steve Ferroni comments on the snare sound on this song in the Wildflowers box set notes, saying, it's an old, lovely 1920 drum I got, and there's only one drum that sounds like that. I still really want to talk to Steve for the podcast, and I'd love to ask him what that snare actually is, because I'm wondering if it's an old Slingerland. When he says 20s, that's when my brain goes straight away, and it definitely has a different crack to it than we hear elsewhere on the album, which really accentuates the brightness of those guitars. The bass is provided by Tom on this one, so I'd also be curious to learn exactly how this one was cut. And I wonder, and I would guess maybe Tom and Steve cut the bed tracks, the drums and the bass and the acoustic guitar, and then Mike and Benmont maybe came in later to fill in the blanks. The chord progression itself is a really simple D, G, C, G, D, up-down groove, and it has that strange jagged sound at the end of each phrase, which I suspect is the harmonium with maybe some extra distortion added. When Tom's vocal comes in, it's doubled, but he sings it so similarly or so well that in places it sounds like it's only one voice, but I'm 95% sure that that's doubled. He's sitting in that very clean, very natural place in his register that doesn't require him to crack his vocal or push into his stretch range at all. One thing I did notice is that I'm pretty sure there's a really, really tight reverb on his vocal, whereas on most of the rest of the record, and per Rick Rubin's deliberate direction, his vocal was treated very naturally and very sparsely. Now, that could just be the room itself that they captured, and it doesn't distract at all from Tom's vocal, but it's probably the only time on the album where, I think at least, the vocal does sound a little bit more processed than normal. And to stress, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing or a detraction. The first verse really just flows straight into the 2-line chorus, which ends on that E minor, A sus alternating phrase. And after 56 seconds of the song, we've had verse chorus already, and the song is clipping along at a really nice, steady 130 beats per minute. And the chorus part with the find somebody who can help somebody alternation sees that second acoustic guitar really striking the strings harder to punch that section home. The second run through the verse chorus is the same as the first, except that we then hear Tom start to bring in the harmonica at the end of the chorus. It's a really quiet, short little harmonica lick that serves to transition the song from this section into the bridge. And this is where this song really, really comes alive. When you listen to the alternate take of the song, there's more going on through the verse chorus. So it's almost like everything in this final version is held back completely. So that once that electric guitar kicks in this section, it really, really pops. And boy, does it ever. When the drums drop out, Mike's electric guitar in that left channel starts playing it's the harmony part to Tom's lead vocal. It's subtle and wonderful, and that gorgeous Rickenbacker 12 string just elevates the track into an entirely different space. As the song moves into the instrumental section, we then get that fantastic orchestron part. It almost has a feel of something like Strawberry Fields to it. It's kind of like that wobble you get in the high frequencies. I'm assuming there's some pitch shifting going on within the mechanism, so you get an unusual ethereal quality to the tone that I find very appealing. This section's also augmented, I'm pretty sure, by Michael Kamen's orchestration. Just a very delicate touch coming back out of this section into the final verse. Final verse which contains my favorite line in the song. Because there's a really Dylan-esque quality to the line, "I gave her my best kiss, she gave it back again." It's a great line because it has a nice little pun in it and it feels kind of throwaway and light, but it also expresses the profoundly heartbreaking sentiment of emotional rejection. But it's not labored or clumsy, and it whizzes by without you really noticing it. The last verse chorus pair leads us into Mike Campbell's solo, and this is something that my guest this week and I did discuss in a little depth. For some reason, Mike's guitar part here is kept panned all the way into the left channel, and it's one of the very, very few production decisions on Wildflowers that leaves me scratching my head just a little bit. It's such a nice, bright, poppy guitar part from Mike that I really would have liked to have heard that panned right down the middle. Under headphones, I just find it ever so slightly distracting that it's panned way over onto the left. Not so when I'm listening, on my stereo, obviously. So it's not a part of the song that tanks it in any way. But it's just a slightly strange choice to me on an album where, production-wise, when you really listen to it, I'd say it's basically as close to perfect as is possible. The end of the guitar solo is actually pretty insane when you really listen to it. Mike is shredding, and I mean shredding, those upwards and downward moving arpeggios at a pretty rapid rate of knots, but he still manages to make it sound breezy and easy. This leads into Tom taking another little harmonica lick, which again, I could complain maybe about being a little buried in the mix, but I won't, it's not something that that tanks the song or anything, so we'll let it slide. We'll let it slide, Rick Rubin. The song ends on one last chord, and then you hear Benmont noodle a little on that harmonium, and then it's all over and done with. Now, the ending on this song is just over a minute long. We have 1 minute and 3 or 4 seconds with no vocal at all. No repetition of the chorus, no vamping or harmonized oohs or any vocal of any kind. And I think it's such a perfect decision to just let the instruments carry the groove and let this song drift away into its ending so casually. I think that if you finished on some sort of vocal crescendo or if you repeated the chorus, I think you'd lose some of the charm of the track. It's 3 verse chorus pairs and a very short chorus at that, and that gorgeous middle section. Boom, in and out. And yet, at 3 minutes 56 seconds, it's the midpoint on the album in terms of length. It just never feels like it is. Okay, folks, it's time for some petty trivia. Your question from 2 weeks ago was this. Which famous rapper shares a birthday with Tom Petty? Is it A, Dr. Dre, B, Snoop Dogg, C, Ice-T, or D, Tupac Shakur? Well, look, rap is territory that I'm completely unfamiliar with, and I only thought of this question because someone in the Tom Petty Nation Facebook group mentioned a couple weeks ago, whenever it was, that they'd like to see an album similar to Petty Country, but with reworkings of Tom's songs by rappers. Now, I'm not as keen on that idea myself, just from a listening perspective or as a musical perspective, as rap really isn't my bag. But it would certainly be interesting to hear rappers take on songs like Here Comes My Girl or Spike or Money Becomes King, for example. All sort of topics and lyrics and sort of styles that you could associate with rappers. Anyway, Andre Rom, and I might get some of these names wrong. I might get the pronunciations wrong, so forgive me if you're a rap fan. Andre Rommel Young was born on February 18th, 1965, and later adopted the stage name Dr. Dre. Now, I know the name, obviously, but I was surprised to learn that he's only released 3 studio albums. Tracy Lauren Marrow, a.k.a. Ice-T, was born in Newark, New Jersey on February 16th, 1958. And as well as a prolific musical career, T has portrayed Detective Tutuola on Law & Order Special Victims Unit for 2.5 decades now, or just about. Tupac Shakur was born Lisanne parish crux on June 16th, 1971, and released 4 albums before being gunned down in Las Vegas on September 13th, 1996, at the age of only 25. Meaning that your answer this week is C. Snoop Dogg. Now, I'm definitely going to get this wrong. Calvin Cordozar Brodus Jr., known professionally as Snoop Dogg, Snoop Doggy Dogg, and briefly Snoop Lion, was born on October 20th, 1971, 21 years after Tom Petty. His debut album, Doggy Style, was released in 1993, during the time when Tom was writing and recording Wildflowers. Quite a contrast in styles and personalities. Your question for this week is this. The 10 extra tracks from the Wildflowers sessions that were released as All the Rest do not feature an appearance from which drummer? So which drummer does not appear on any song on All the Rest? Is it A, Steve Ferroni, B, Jim Keltner, C, Stan Lynch, or D, Ringo Starr? Okay, back to the song. I always consider this one of Tom's great ambiguous lyrics. And Jaan Uhelzski writes in the liner notes for Wildflowers and all the rest that Petty seems to be nervously taking stock, weighing options, reminiscing, trying to keep his incipient anxiety at bay, and trying to hold on to a few last remnants of his former life. Benmont Tench says it's another song that sounds like it's all about whoever, but these songs were about him. And whatever meaning you layer on afterwards, I do love that Mike Campbell makes the following observation on this song. You reflect on it after the fact, and maybe you can read things into it, but in the moment, you're just putting your nose to the grindstone. Which I love that. Mike, ever the workman, hey, ever the craftsman. So the most obvious parallel to draw is that this song is about spirituality, about rising above the challenges of everyday life and taking inspiration from the numinous. You could also reasonably infer that it's another song examining the breakdown of Tom's marriage, and as Jaan Uhelzski pondered, trying to salvage something from it. But ever since my conversation with Nick Apostolaris for the Hard On Me episode, I've read a different angle on this song. For me, the second verse takes me into a different headspace. While I fool myself and I don't know why, I thought we could ride this out. I was up all night making up my mind, but now I've got my doubts. I got my eye on the waterline trying to keep my sense of humor, but if we don't get to a higher place and find somebody who can help somebody, etc., etc., might this be about Stan Lynch and the band writ large? Might this be Tom saying that he just didn't know what to do about the tensions with Stan and that the band couldn't be allowed to stagnate? It has to move past the tension and get to a higher place. Yes, the third verse is more pointedly about a male-female relationship, but the first verse is also very abstract. So I would contend that this could be Tom possibly exploring band dynamics and then playing a little bait and switch on us in the last lyric to make sure that we don't get too comfortable in one mode of ideation or another. At the end of the day, it's what makes the song work so well. It's a one-size-fits-all jacket that any of us can wear anytime. Some of us might wear it as a summer jacket, just in case there's a short shower while we're out walking. Some of us might wear it as a parka, with the hood zipped up against the wind. And some of us might wear it with the sleeves rolled up as we fly down the highway in our open-top 1965 Mustang. I said earlier that I'd talk a little about the alternate version on Finding Wildflowers, and I'll be covering that fully once I'm through the main catalogue and start going back to do the B-sides and the outtakes and all these kinds of releases that we got later on in chronological order. But I wanted to just highlight this one for a specific reason. For me, the alternate version sounds way, way, way more like a Heartbreaker song than a Petty solo song. It's fuller, and I think Benmont's piano and the organ gives it more width, and I really like the key change ending of it. Of all the alternate takes that came out with Finding Wildflowers, this is the only one that I think I might marginally prefer to the album version. Tom's vocal delivery is consistent, although not double throughout. And again, Benmont's organ part just adds a very rich color to it. And overall, it feels a bit more bouncy and a bit more fun to me. But again, it's a subjective preference thing, and I still really like the final album version that we ended up with. Today's guest conversation sees the return of the uniquely brilliant and inventive musician and YouTuber, Ivan Anderson. Ivan Anderson Returns bonus episode coming out this Friday for you, as we had a massively free-ranging conversation about his recent collaboration and his upcoming new album, as well as touching on Guns N' Roses, Van Halen, Queen, and all kinds of other bands and topics. And look, when you have a guy like Ivan on, there's just so much to talk about. But for now, sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with the mind behind the genius of the Cyberattack Extended Universe. Okay, so Wildflowers, I think on its face, when I was thinking about, and I'd asked you to come back on to talk about one of the songs, because I've had a guest on for each song on this season. And originally I'd sort of wanted you to come on and talk about Hard on Me, because I remember the first time you were on, the three words you chose to describe Tom Petty were verge of tears.
Yeah.
I thought, well, Hard on Me there'd be some symbiosis there. But then we kind of blew past that, and we had some scheduling difficulties. And so I was like, well, Higher Place would be an interesting one too, because that's the really upbeat, poppy, bright. Well, on it superficially anyway, but it's densely packed with all this stuff that you don't notice that's going on, which I find when I listen to your music almost every time. I'm like, oh, I hadn't noticed that before. There's something else, just a little thing there, just once, and it's kind of cool. So, but with Wildflowers, where does it sit with in the sort of Petty canon with you? What was your experience with sort of discovering it? Do you love it? Is it sort of a peripheral one? Where does it sit for you?
I have like kind of mixed feelings about it, to be honest. Um, there are things about it that there's three different things it can do. One of which is like the classic Tom Petty thing, which I consider to be the verge of tears thing. We've talked about this, where
Right.
he's like, there's a kind of vulnerability he gets to, but it's like a tough guy's vulnerability. And he's sort of leading with it in this way that is like actually makes him seem kind of more masculine and tough. I mean, I'm thinking of just a song. It's not on the record, but to me, it's a classic example. Don't do me like that.
Yeah.
Just as a title of a song that kind of nails the vibe I'm talking about. Or you got lucky. You got lucky with me. That's the same kind of thing. He's like clearly hurt, or he's clearly afraid to get hurt. He's like being emotional, but
Yeah.
he's doing it in this way that is a little bit like, you sure you want to do that? you know uh the that quality and that sort of like version of tough guy vulnerability is my favorite thing that Tom Petty does.
Right.
So I think there's places on the record where he does that. Uh, and the big hit is a good example of it. You don't know how it feels to be me is like,
Yeah.
that's right from the wheelhouse of the kind of thing I'm talking about. And there are traces of it in some of the other songs too, including A Higher Place, but we'll get to that in a second.
Okay.
And when that is happening on Wildfires, I'm like, yeah, this is what I always signed up for. Then there's some stuff on it that is like mysterious. Like I think the opening track is sort of cool, but also a little bit mysterious. And to me, the opening track is a little bit like, this is going to be what I feel about the first song on Wildflowers is that he's like, this is going to be the beginning of an unexpected journey.
Yeah.
It's like one of those first tracks. It reminds me a little bit of a first track almost like on a Pink Floyd album or something, like Pigs on the Wing. Like on a
Yeah.
musical level, there's nothing about Pigs on the Wing that sounds like Wildflowers to me, but on a more sort of like album position statement,
Yeah.
it feels a little bit like this is the intro to something you don't even know where we're gonna go. That's how I
Right.
feel about track one on Wildflowers. That's not the normal Tom Petty thing, but I'm like excited for it and I'm like open to it.
Yeah.
And then the third Tom Petty thing that Wildflowers does, which is my least favorite, is the thing that feels a little bit more like commentary or like social commentary. I mean, or like
Okay.
the moral of the story, or like the Tom Petty story song that is also has a certain like here he's telling you what his point of view is a little bit on the way society's going. Like I
Okay.
would consider even again not on this album, but Into the Great Wide Open to me is like very quintessential example of this type of Tom Petty song where he's
Okay.
like So he's telling you a story. It's not personal. He's telling you a story about this musical artist, and through it all, you can tell that he's a little bit also injecting some opinion about the state of the music industry these days. And
Right.
it feels a little bit like just I'm gonna tell you what I think, as
Okay,
opposed
that's
to
interesting.
this is how I feel.
So then I would feel fairly safe then saying I would imagine that The Last DJ isn't exactly your maybe not your favorite Tom Petty album then because that is quite didactic in that way, right?
Correct. Yes. That and like so the songs on Wildflowers that I think of this way is like it's good to be king to me has this quality.
Okay.
Um and a higher ground a little bit to me uh every time I hear it, I feel like we're supposed to be thinking what it's an allegory for. I mean,
Okay.
I might be wrong about this, but I've always assumed that he's like talking about like, you know, there's some sort of force coming into our society that is dangerous, you
Okay.
know, politically, or like there's something things are not going well here in these United
Interesting.
States,
Okay.
and we got to make sure we get out before the temperature gets too hot with all this no good. That to me is what the song sounds like. Now,
Cool.
I'm not exactly sure what it is, but to me, it feels more like a one of his social commentary songs than one of his like emotional jams.
Interesting. Yeah, because to me it's it's almost like a stitching piece for me, this one, because I think that there's we were talking about Hard on Me with my friend Nick Apostolaris, and he said that it's sort of, the breakup that Tom's going through on Wildflowers with his marriage is falling apart. But it's also that breakdown with Stan. So you've got that
Hmm.
creative breakdown within the band
Hmm.
where that long-term relationship and a lot of brotherly love, obviously, but a lot of conflict has come to a head and has gone past. And to me, I always interpret Higher Place as being it's sort of him a creative statement about we need to move past that element. So again, I think that this is something, and I talk about this all the time, that Petty's brilliant at is he can write one set of lyrics that you and I both take completely differently. We read them completely different.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Okay. I guess I would say like a lot of my favorite Tom Petty songs are sort of like non-metaphorical.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like you don't do me like that is like just completely literal. I mean,
Yeah.
you can find other levels there if you want to, but like if you take it at face value, it sort of works.
Right.
Um, and that's usually my taste. I mean,
Okay.
I tend to like stuff that can just work on the level of like Axl Rose saying, "I'm fucking innocent." You
Right.
know,
Yeah.
you can put as many levels there as you want, but if we just go to no level, it's like it's kind of cool there too.
Yeah. I see
Um,
what you're saying. Yeah.
and this is a song where like you don't really get the goods on the face value level.
Right. Yeah. No, no. It is. It's that sort of universality and that abstract nature. It's 100%. Absolutely 100%. Musically, though, it's almost I don't know if you've listened did you ever go back and listen to, like, the home demos and all the stuff that got released sort of with the
I
Wildflowers and all
have
the rest?
not heard all of that stuff.
The demo for this one, it's almost just like, yeah, this just sounds like an early Beatles track because with that strumming pattern is very George Harrison. It's got the
Uh-huh, uh-huh.
harmonica. It kinda it sounds a feels it not sounds like, feels a bit like Love Me Do. Like, it's got that kinda 60s pop rock sensibility to it musically.
Yeah, okay, I know what you're describing. To me, the finished version actually to me it sounds a little demo-ish.
Right.
By which I mean the end it sort of ends with this like instrumental vamp. And there's like actually a few songs on this record do that, right? It's
Yeah.
good to be king ends like that. You don't know how it feels ends like that.
Yeah.
This one ends with the vamp, but to me, it's a little bit like to me, it sort of feels like guys that are putting down a demo or putting down a basic track and they're going to figure out the arrangement later. Right
Right.
now, they're just sort of sketching out the form of the song because, like, the guitar player is this one of the songs where Mike Campbell's on it? It sounds like Mike Campbell to me, but I don't know if
Mike's
it
on
is one of the.
electric, and he plays bass on this one as well, so he's playing electric
Okay,
guitar and bass, and Tom plays acoustic, yeah.
right. So at the end, he starts going off. Like there's some
Yeah.
like Mike Campbell guitar playing, but it's like all on one channel. It's like pan to one side.
Yeah.
It's not sort of given the presentation of, it's like, this is what you're supposed to be paying attention to.
Right.
Instead, it's kind of just like, it feels like the sort of quirk in the performance. Uh, Whereas the end of You Don't Know How It Feels, even though they're just sort of living in the instrumental groove, everything is much more like, we want you to hear this, and then we want you to hear that. And the
Right.
little Wurlitzer part, we want you to notice it. And then when it's gone, you notice that it's gone.
Yeah.
Whereas the end of this song is kind of like, we're all here, we're going to keep the tape going a little bit. We're going to play. Here comes Mike Campbell, but it's only over there. To me, it felt a little bit almost more like, yeah, it felt like guys that are sort of establishing, okay, we're rolling tape, and the song needs to go to a certain point, and then we're going to come
Right.
back later and make heads or tails of it.
Interesting. Yeah. So a couple of questions on to follow up on that. Then I had a conversation with a friend once who he said that it frustrates him when a guitar solo is panned because his
Mhm.
sort of, and he's a producer and a writer, and he says that to him a guitar solo is replacing the lead vocal, so it should be in the
Uh-huh.
same place in the mix. And now, I mean, again, we're big Van Halen fans, and of course Ed was always panned.
Yes.
That's where panning it can be used, and I don't always love it either with Van Halen, and I don't always love it on Wildflowers, where because there's lots and lots of panning on Wildflowers generally, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So does that, in terms of sort of preference, would you stand on solos? Should a solo be in the middle
I
generally?
I don't want to I don't want to get that specific.
Okay.
To me, I think a lot of the Van Halen solos are panned, and that's okay. But that's a good example, because everything else about the arrangement on a Van Halen song is like, when it's time for a solo, it's just time for a solo, dummy. Like,
Right.
they're just like handing it to you. You know what I mean? And like,
Yeah.
the solo gets set up with like a drum fill and David Lee Roth sort of like doing a wail and then getting away from the mic. And like, compositionally, they sort of build this little on ramp to the solo.
Right.
And then the other thing they do is, like, even if the solo is on one side, the reverb is on the other side. So
Yeah.
you're still getting some amount of um, dimensional goodness there. So it's not the panning position so much as, like, in this particular Tom Petty song, that solo just sort of comes out of him playing rhythm on the whole track, and he's in his one little spot, and then he continues to be in that spot, and everyone else continues to be in their spot, and they're all kind of doing what they've always been doing. But
Right.
all of a sudden this guy's like kind of taking a step forward, but
Yeah.
nothing else in the track or the panning or the arrangement or the presentation, nothing else is sort of being like, all eyes on Mike Campbell.
Right.
So it's, to me, it's not just a panning thing, it feels a little bit more like a half measure.
Okay.
You know?
Sort of tacked on kind of thing. Like it.
Yeah, or like an incomplete
Right. Yeah.
incomplete idea. Like, I that performance, it sounds like he's playing some shit. Like, if that's what I'm supposed to be paying attention to, there's all kinds of cues you can give me as a listener to tell me that I should be paying attention to that. But if you're gonna have him play that and then not give me any of those other cues, there's a part of me that's just sort of like, I don't know what I'm supposed to decide, because it seems like you didn't
Right.
decide.
Right. Yeah. And like you said, if you go back to You Don't Know How It Feels, you're supposed to listen to the harmonica because that's the hook. Right. That's the hook in the
Yeah.
song. Where with this one, this song doesn't actually really have a hook. I mean, maybe it's the breakdown. I really like the breakdown. I love the harmonies in that middle section, but it doesn't have that same thing. And I talked last week about I was talking to my last guest about House in the Woods being probably the least Wildflowers E song on Wildflowers. This is
Uh-huh.
probably the second least Wildflowers E. In that, like you said, and I'm sort of thinking on the fly here, but it isn't as focused as some of those other songs. You're right. Now that I'm thinking about it, like that, because it's quite a long outro too. There's quite a long tail
Yes.
on this, which doesn't
Yes.
maybe necessarily doesn't need it, and it's 357, which I don't mind
Mhm.
because I quite like the vibe and the groove, but it doesn't quite have that focus. I think that's the word I would land on is that focus. Yeah, you're right.
I mean, I wonder how much we're supposed to do with the fact that the album is literally named Wildflowers. And maybe we're just supposed to be thinking of all of this as like, it was just the sort of like unstructured growth that came up in an
Right.
abandoned lot. It's not that they went out and structured a garden and we're like, here's where we're going to plant this, here's where we're going to plant that, and every other day we're going to have a guy come out and trim this. So
Yeah.
everything's always going to look very established. This is like an abandoned lot where a bunch of wildflowers grew up in between the cracks,
Yeah.
and that's what came up, and we're going to take a picture of it, and now you can have it.
I love that. And it's funny because on the obverse of that is that it was worked on for months and months and months, right? And not, I don't think I would use the word labored over because labor implies that it was hard work and everyone was kind of pissed off
Yeah.
with it. But it was a lot of care and attention because, again, on this song, man, you've got Benmont Tench on piano, Hammond organ, and harmonium, and you've got that bloody orchestra that plays. You get like an orchestra
Hmm.
solo almost, which
Hmm.
is weird, and it's not the same, orchestrally. We get crawling back to you. It's a feature. It's not a bug. Same thing on it. It's good to be king. But here, it's almost just thrown away. Like it's okay. Well, Michael came and we'll just bring him in for this section, but then it just drops out, and then you, like I said, then you get that the Mike Campbell guitar. But then so in that way, there's a lot of stuff, and you've got some harmonica on this one as well.
Yeah.
But so there is lots of things going on in this song. There's a ton of stuff going on, but it doesn't seem as, like you said, there's not really any one point where you think, oh, I'm listening to that now.
Yeah. So my favorite part of this song is the lines where he goes, I stayed up all night trying to make my mind up, but today I'm not so sure.
Yeah, yeah. I
Something
know which
like
one you
that.
mean.
That's not exactly what it is. Let me see if I can get exactly what it is.
Yeah, I was up all night making up my mind, but now I've got my doubts.
Yeah, that.
Yeah,
Yeah, that. So that to me is like the Tom Petty quality thing.
right.
If there's this contradiction where he's saying like I'm not so sure, but
Yeah,
by admitting that, you just sort of believe him anyway. It
yeah,
makes him feel like a more trustworthy person.
yeah,
So you end up kind of leaning forward and being like, well, just tell me what else you think, even though what he's telling you is like, I tried to make up my mind and I couldn't.
yeah.
And that again is that contradictory thing is my favorite Tom Petty quality.
Well, and then you get that. I love that sort of very Dylan-esque thing because he got more comfortable with sort of, his influence by Dylan showing through. And you get, I gave her my best kiss. She gave it back again.
Yeah.
And I gave her my best kiss. There's something about that it's very Dylan-y, right? Like it's got that quality to it.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a funny thing to talk about because I know Tom Petty like worshipped Bob Dylan
Yeah,
and talked about him as like the greatest songwriter of all time. And then also he wrote You're Jamming Me, right?
yeah. Co-wrote with him. Yeah,
Right. Okay. So, because there was that whole thing about how, like, in the middle of You're Jamming Me, he just starts going after these, like, pop cultural figures who, like, I mean, it's funny because, like, Eddie Murphy, we still know who he is. Eddie Murphy,
yeah,
he goes after Eddie Murphy in that song. We know who Eddie Murphy is. He's, like, one of the most famous entertainers ever. Also goes after Joe Piscopo. It's
I
like,
had to Google him when I did that episode.
yeah, right. It's like all these years later, it's like, well, who the fuck is that? Uh, um, so I remember like hearing like that song and just being like, why? Like, what did Eddie Murphy and Joe Piscopo ever do that was so wrong?
Yeah,
I saw some interview with Tom Petty at one point where he was like, listen, like, I wrote that song with one of the greatest songwriters of all time. And like, that was the part he came in with. And I'm not going to ask questions.
yeah. Go ask Bob what his problem with Eddie Murphy is.
Yeah. So I this brings me to a place I get from time to time, which is that many people whose work I admire the work of Bob Dylan. I personally have no problem saying that I think like Tom Petty is a far superior songwriter than Bob Dylan.
Yeah,
I got no problem saying that. I think
yeah,
he's a better songwriter and a better musician and like an overall superior talent.
yeah. Yeah, no. I mean, look, I'm a huge Dylan fan too, but Dylan, I think for me is probably the best lyricist of all time, just in terms of his ability to bend words to his will and then just write absolute gibberish, but make it sound really, really cool. But then
Okay.
also write
Yeah.
brilliantly insightful, observations on the human condition as a songwriter. I mean, he's written some really great some stuff on Time Out of Mind is really cool, and Rough and Ready Ways, his new album is really, really cool. But a lot of it's pretty much just cowboy chords, three cowboy chords, which there's nothing wrong
Right.
with. But as a songwriter, I don't think he's spectacular. Where Tom it sort of blends those two, right? He's got that lyrical bent, but he's also got the melodic sense, the sort of sense
Mhm.
of intricacy that to bring in and knows when to pull back and when to push and all those types of things. So yeah, in terms of musicianship, I mean, Dylan's, famously he's just Bob Dylan, sort of sits
Yeah,
outside
right,
all of it,
okay.
right? So,
Okay, cool. Yeah, I wasn't sure how controversial it was gonna
oh,
be for me to say this.
I don't think so.
Uh, so I'm glad it's not a huge scandal. But it is also kind of funny for me to think like Tom Petty just sang this song where he like talks trash about Eddie Murphy and he himself doesn't even know why.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I like Eddie Murphy, but sorry, I like Tom Petty, but I just kind of feel like, man, if you're gonna, I love Eddie Murphy. Like, if you're
Yeah,
gonna
it's a
go
weird
after him,
person
you
to
gotta
pick
have
on.
a
Yeah.
better reason than that. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like,
I'd,
Eddie
I'd be
Murphy rules.
I'd be willing to bet that it was one of those things where Dylan came in with that, and Dylan's just probably seen an Eddie Murphy movie that day or something, and just that's the name that fits. It fits the cadence, it fits the ballad, and it fits. He's kind of a cultural touch point. But I'd be willing to bet that Dylan had no problem with Eddie Murphy. It's just the name that popped up. I'd put money on that because that's what Dylan did sometimes, right?
Yeah, I guess. Yes. I mean, to me, they also kind of represent like in some ways Eddie Murphy and Bob Dylan are like represent opposite forces for me
Right.
culturally in a
Yeah.
way. Like I'm not gonna I'm only gonna talk about what they mean to me. Like I'm about to say some shit that Bob Dylan fans are really gonna disagree with, and like
Right.
they might be right. Like this could be my own ignorance, but like I usually feel as if I just do not know like what he means or what he's talking about or like what I'm supposed to take from any of what he's saying. There are
Right.
some exceptions to this, but in general, the feeling I get from any given Bob Dylan song is just kind of like this feels obscure to me in a way that I do not know how to make heads or tails of.
Right.
Okay, then Eddie Murphy, on the other hand, and for the purpose of this conversation, I'm going to confine myself to the great Eddie Murphy stand-up specials, Delirious and Raw, which I consider to be works of art.
Yep.
Those are just like instantly funny, and then also when you think about them, have like as many levels as you want to go. So to me, like I kind of feel like forced to choose. The Eddie Murphy approach to life is what I'm all about.
Right.
Uh, and the fact that Bob Dylan would just sort of like nonsensically go after him and then Joe Piscopo as if like those two people are equal talents. To me, it's just sort of
Oh
like,
my lord.
yeah, this is
Yeah.
another example of I don't know what the fuck is going on over there.
Yeah.
But then it's funny to me that I'm a Tom Petty fan, and Tom Petty was sort of caught in the middle and was just like, well, look, I don't really know, but I'm sticking with
Yeah.
Bob.
Yeah. It is funny. I mean, jamming me generally is we talked about, when we talked in our longer chat about confusing things like Appetite for Destruction, or sorry, Chinese Democracy and Van Halen 3 and those kinds of albums. Jamming me is kind of the same type of thing. I'm not too sure what this even is. It's a 12
Yeah,
bar blues, I get that, but
yeah.
then it's not coherent lyrically. Thematically, it's all over the place. I just don't know what the hell it's supposed to be. But I can also just enjoy the riff, So
Yeah, I mean, I think like I have a friend named Kerry Gitter who once said that he thinks Jamming Me represents the sort of like the rapid changing pace of 80s pop culture as experienced by guys who were generationally formed by the 60s. And
interesting.
like basically what that song is about is sort of just like Bob Dylan being confused and probably threatened by like the increasing pace of everything and like
Right.
you know like now everything has to have music videos and now like digital signals are everywhere and mobile phones are
Right.
beginning to happen and the news cycle is like 24/7 like this is a guy who when he was a kid the TV stations would turn off,
Yes.
right? If you
Yeah.
like turn on TV too late, there is no TV, right? In the 80s, it's like, well, why the fuck should there be no TV? We got more shit we could say, you
Yeah.
know? So on some level, that song, the nonsense is just like almost more of a sensory reaction to like a world where the TVs are on all the time, and he's getting jammed from that. And then somehow, because that's what the song is, he's got to talk about the faces of the people he sees on TV, and that's how we get to Joe Piscopo and Eddie Murphy.
I must say too, to a European ear, the name Joe Piscopo is just funny.
Oh, for sure,
It's just
for
a
sure.
funny name, right? Like it's just a weird sounding, odd. I'm assuming Italian. I'm assuming in its
Yeah,
roots
it's
someplace, right?
Italian.
So
Yeah.
yeah, the Bronx.
Well,
I get the
Joe.
Bronx, right? It sounds like the Bronx.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I guess that's sort of what's going on. But I think it's within Eddie Murphy's rights to be like, well, hold on. Like,
Yeah. Oh,
I was
totally.
just here minding my own fucking business. Like, I don't, leave me out of it.
Yeah. Why are you saddling me with Joe Piscopo? Like, can we not
Yeah, right.
do
It's
two
like,
different
he's just
songs?
like, it's just sort of funny to be like, are you under the impression that like me and Joe are the two funniest people in the world? Because like I might be the funniest person in the world, but if you think Joe Piscopo is number two, I don't want to be number one anymore.
I wouldn't want to be a part of any club that would have Joe Piscopo as a member, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Exactly right. Yeah.
Oh, good lord, that's funny. Yeah, I mean, Higher Place. I think too that it's interesting sequentially on the album because we get it at track 12, and it sits in between To Find a Friend, but it goes into House in the Woods. So it's this little, like, To Find a Friend's a very specific thing in a very specific group. It's got Ringo on it, so you get that kind of whole thing.
Hmm.
But House in the Woods is totally different. It's got this weird sonic, and it's almost got an abrasiveness to it, and the length is almost oppressive. But I don't find that song too long. I really quite like the groove again. But so Higher Place it's a strange one. It's the only place I think where the sequencing is a bit not off, and I don't know where else you would put it either. Like I'm not suggesting you could put it anywhere else, but it's the one song where I don't get it coming out of To Find a Friend or going into House in the Woods, if that makes any sense.
I'm with you. This is another place where the best I can do is to say like we're supposed to think of this whole thing
Yeah,
as wildflowers. It's like the ungardened garden.
yeah,
And so like this is the place where it's sprung up. So we just have to accept that that's, it's a dandelion next to a tulip,
right, right.
you know. Uh but except that the other thing I'll add is that it also what you're describing, some of these like late track listing weird bullshit things is also to me a hallmark of the CD era. This to me, Wildflowers feels like a CD more than an LP.
Right.
It's got the longer running length. It's got some of the material that where I'm like, did this need to be here?
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
uh, and the order. At a certain point, it's also like this might sound more harsh than I mean it to, but like people were still maybe figuring out the art of a CD track list at this point, whereas people had already kind of a consensus had already formed about an LP, where it's
Yeah.
like you got side one, side two. So that means your fourth or fifth track is going to be the end of a side.
Yeah.
Like when I first got Led Zeppelin 4, it was astounding to me that Stairway to Heaven was track 4. I was like, what the fuck are you doing with the song like Stairway to Heaven in the middle of a
Yeah.
CD? You know what I mean? It's like that's an ending. Like Stairway to Heaven is an ending. And then I realized that's the ending of side one,
Yeah.
So I feel like the LP track listing thing, people had sort of come to a broad agreement socially about like what the moves are,
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much that existed for the CD at this point in the 90s.
Yeah. And I mean, if you think about it, so the album's 62 minutes, and on a CD you got 79 minutes, which Metallica always used down to the microsecond, I think. But they didn't. So you've got 15 tracks, and then we end up with the extra 10 that didn't make the album. So they definitely could have put more material on there if they were doing it for CD. Of course, we end up with the vinyl, and I think that there is a coherence to most of the rest of the album when you look at it and you flip the sides and tracks
Mhm.
lead into each other. And especially Crawling Back to You into Wake Up Time to me is like, yeah, that's how you end an album. Of course, those two have to finish. It's just that one to me is always that one that's like a bit okay. It's not an it's if you're on four sides of a vinyl, it's definitely not an opener. It's definitely not a closer. So you sort of have to just wedge it in someplace, right? So I don't know. I overthink these things all the
Yeah,
time
I
too. So
I mean, I'm with you. I agree that it feels a little bit like, now here's this.
yeah, yeah, for sure. And to get away from, well, I've done Cabin Down Below, I've done You Wreck Me, we've done the rockers, we've done the more pensive stuff, we've done all that kind of stuff. Here's another look. And I think there are songs on that didn't make the album that possibly could. I mean, Somewhere Under Heaven, I think, is just phenomenal. It's this
Mhm,
big, beautiful, bright thing. California is great. There are things that thematically fit better. So I think
mhm.
maybe you're right. It is like, okay, let's do something a bit different here. So cool.
Yeah.
Well, dude, thanks for sharing all your thoughts about Wildflowers and High Place with me. That's kind of cool. It's always
Dude,
nice.
it was my pleasure. It was my pleasure.
It's always nice to get a different take too, because usually people gush about Wildflowers, right? So it's always
Yeah.
nice when someone actually does come in and say, well, actually not as keen on this element of it. And when it's someone like you who actually has a musical vocabulary that I trust, okay, we're all in safe hands here. No one's going to get upset, I think. So
Thanks. I'm glad to hear it. There's one last thing I want to say about it. Uh it was back to the line I said I like, where he was like, I was up all night, but now I
yeah.
have my doubts. That actually reminds me of a completely different thing. But I think it's interesting that like these two things are doing a similar trick, which is there's a Dr. Dre lyric that I think is equivalent. It's from The Watcher.
Okay.
There's a part in this song where Dr. Dre, he's like challenging a guy, and he says something like, "Just remember that you're fucking with a family man. I got a lot more to lose than you." I don't know if that's
Okay.
exactly how it comes out of the rhyme and everything, but that's what he's saying. Just remember you're fucking with a family man. I got more to lose than you. Normally, being a family man is supposed to be like a sign of weakness.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like there's a one of the taunts in Street Fighter 2 is he's like, "You're not a fighter. Maybe you should go be a family man." That's like one of the things either Guile or Ken says after they kick your ass. I forget whether it's Guile or Ken. Um, so like family man is normally like, this guy does not have a heart of ice.
Right.
Um, but I like the way that Dr. Dre flips it around. It's like, no, 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 no. The fact that I got a family, man, the fact that I got a family means that I'm going to fight with a different level of conviction.
100%. Yeah.
And it actually makes them tougher. And to me, that's the same thing as Tom Petty being like, I tried to make up my mind. Now I'm not so sure. That
Yeah.
just instantly makes him more credible. And like, well, now I do believe you. So what do you think? Uh, in the same way that Dr. J is like, family man is what makes you tough. There's something about that kind of reversal that always gets me.
Okay, Pettyheads, that's it for this week. So first of all, let me say that if we were talking about the alternate version of this song, I think I'd score it 1 full point higher than I have. And if I were in the habit of giving half marks, I think this would be one of the in-betweeny type songs. And for me, A Higher Place is sort of the second least Wildflowers-y sounding song on the album. Not sonically or thematically exactly, but it just has a little something that doesn't feel quite like the rest of the album. It's possibly Mike's gloriously bright guitar tone. I don't know. But this one and the next track always feel like those songs where Tom didn't want us to be able to predict what would be coming next. I've also mentioned during the course of the episode that there are a couple of places where I find the production choices a little strange, but overall, the mood and drive of A Higher Place mean that I'm giving it a very solid 7 out of 10. And I can already hear Lisa Kelly Pennington cursing at me from all those miles away. The Tom Petty Project is a proud member of the Deep Dive Podcast Network. Go check us out on Twitter at Deep Dive Podnet. There's lots there to like, and I'm sure you'll find something that you want to listen to. You can also check out my other podcast, Seaside Pod Review, a Queen podcast that I do with Randy Woods, and check out the Ultimate Catalog Clash that I co-host with one of my guests from this season, Corey Morissette. We have just wrapped up the Foo Fighters. The sort of season wrap episode comes out on tomorrow as I'm recording this. So I can tell you now, because we'll already know, that the next season, as we've just wrapped up Foo Fighters, season 4 of the Ultimate Catalog Clash, is going to be covering the music of Dire Straits, a band that I love and I'm hoping that Corey learns to love. Don't forget to follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, and YouTube at The Tom Petty Project, and on Twitter at Tom Petty Project. Go follow, like, subscribe, do all those things. Please do leave a review or a rating. Keep talking to me on social media, and I'll keep reading those comments out on the show. And as your weekly reminder, the Tom Petty Project is not affiliated with the Tom Petty Estate in any way. So if you're looking for Tom's music, please visit official streaming platforms, or again, go to your local independent record seller. Go grab some physical media. It does make a difference, folks. If you're looking for official merchandise, go to tompetty.com. And if you're looking for merchandise for this show, please go to tompettyproject.com. And I do have a brand new design up there that I just got shipped to myself. It's like waves crashing on the beach is the text. And then we've got a nice like seaside graphic to go with it. It's really, really cool. And it's nice, a nice blue t-shirt it comes in. Don't forget to check out the Tom Petty Nation and Tom Petty Fans Forever groups on Facebook. And check out Tom Petty Radio, which is channel 31 on Sirius XM. Until we meet again next week, keep listening to and sharing Tom's music. Try to be kind. Try to say I love you to someone at least once a day. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll be back with you next week to talk about the greasy, low-slung rocker, House in the Woods. Bye-bye.